Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com. In this tutorial I want to talk very briefly about bean scope, which is something that you might find it useful to know about sometimes. If you look at a bean in the XML view, so let's go to beans XML, and I'll go to the beans view, the kind of user interface view. You can see that there's this scope field here, and if I click on that, we can set this to various values. We're only going to look at prototype and singleton in this particular tutorial. The others, request, session, and request and session, they only apply to web stuff, which we haven't looked at yet, so we'll just stick to two initially. And what these are is, if you create a bean, by default it's a singleton. So let's take an example here. I've got this person bean that I'm using in my main application. Let's actually change this program a bit so that I'll get the same bean twice from the container like this. So I'll call one person 1 and the second one person 2. Let's get rid of these speak statements here. And what I'll do is I'll output person 2 with a system.out.println, and I'll change person 1. So I'll say person1.set tax ID, and I'll set the tax ID to something memorable like 666, which is easy enough to remember. So we've given person 1 the tax ID of the devil, and I'll run this, and we see that person 2 here, which I've output, if you look closely, this font's quite small, but if you look closely you'll see person 2 has also been given the tax ID 666. Why is that? It's because the person bean is a singleton, and no matter how many times we request this bean from the container, we'll always be given the same bean. So it's just giving us different handles, if you like, different references to the same object. And that's the default behavior, and we get that behavior if we set the scope of the beans to singleton. So if I set the scope field here on beans.xml, I click my person bean. I should mention that, that's important. Select that, and then set the scope to singleton and save it. And then look at the raw XML view. What it's actually done is it's just added a attribute here to the person bean, which is here, and it's added an attribute to the opening XML tag that says scope equals singleton, and that's the default. So if we run that, we'll get exactly the same behavior as the default. But what we can do is we can change this to prototype. I could just type it here, which normally I would do, but just to show you the user interface as well. Let's just change it here, change the scope to prototype and save it, and we'll look at their source and we see that it's changed it here to prototype. Now if I run it again, you see the tax ID hasn't changed for person 2. So what's happening is, now every time we request the person bean from the container, we get a new object being created, a new version or a new prototype of the object. So that's just a little thing about bean scope, and of course when we change it for person 1, it's not changing it for person 2, therefore, which it would do by default if they point to the same object. I'll leave it there for this tutorial, just a little thing to be aware of that you might find useful. And we've still got some more useful and important stuff to look at in the context of beans and wiring them up, quite a lot of stuff actually. So we'll get onto that starting with the next tutorial. So join me again then, and until next time, happy coding.